Tonight, we dive into the legend of beings who rose from the sea. Not gods of heaven, not angels of scripture, but teachers of a lost civilization. Oannes and the Apkallu, figures half man, half fish, whose wisdom shaped language, law, and the stars themselves, yet vanished from history as if they never existed. Their stories were recorded, fragmented, and hidden by time, and when the church rose to power, they were buried further beneath silence, mistranslation, and fear. These weren't mere myths. They were reminders of knowledge older than scripture, of truths about the world and humanity that the powerful wanted erased. Tonight, we follow the trail from the Persian Gulf to the scrolls of Babylon, from secret star maps in Africa to cryptic symbols in Renaissance art, and ask why the church never acknowledged these teachers from the deep. The records are scattered, the tales forbidden, and those who sought them often disappeared into the shadows of history. So before you sail further into the story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Imagine standing on the shores of an ancient sea, the sun setting over a vast horizon, when suddenly the surface breaks, not with a wave, but with a figure. Not a beast, not a man, but something in between. A creature draped in scales, crowned with wisdom, walking out from the deep. His name was Oannes, and unlike anything from the Bible or Greek myth, he did not come to destroy. He came to teach. From the earliest records of Mesopotamia, long before Rome and even Egypt reached their height, the story of Oannes was passed down, not as legend, but as memory. He emerged from the Persian Gulf each day and returned to the sea at night, wearing the skin of a fish, but speaking the language of humans. He brought knowledge to a people who had none. He taught them to write, to build, to live in cities, to measure the stars and understand the movement of time. It is said that before Oannes, humanity lived like animals. After him, civilization began. And yet, for someone so pivotal, Oannes is almost never mentioned in religious texts taught today. You won't find him in church sermons or history classes. He isn't included in discussions of ancient prophets or spiritual guides. He's not labeled a god or a demon, just quietly ignored. The question is why? Why would a being remembered as the first teacher of mankind be excluded from every major modern religion? Some say it is because his story does not fit the approved timeline. Others say it is because he came not from the sky, like angels or gods, but from the water. And in most holy books, water is not a source of truth. It is chaos. It is the flood. It is danger. But Mesopotamians saw the sea differently. To them, it was the beginning of all things. The ocean was not feared, it was revered. They believed knowledge could rise from the deep, and Oannes was the living symbol of that. The first being to show that wisdom did not belong only to the heavens, but also to the earth and to what lay beneath it. He was not a conqueror, not a ruler, but a guide, a teacher, and that may have been the most dangerous thing of all. Religions built on obedience, fear figures that encourage thinking, institutions that seek to control the past, fear stories that suggest a different origin. If Oannes really existed, then civilization may not have started with divine command, but with someone who simply wanted to help. Someone not bound to any one faith. Someone who emerged from the sea not to preach, but to share knowledge freely. So what if this was true? What if the greatest secret of human history didn't fall from the sky, but stepped out of the waves? A being who came not once, but returned each day, quietly building the first foundation of knowledge, and then vanishing beneath the tide before nightfall. Maybe that's why Oannes is forgotten, because he was never meant to fit inside a story controlled by anyone. He was bigger than that. He was the beginning of something no church ever wanted you to remember. In the 3rd century before the birth of Christ, a priest named Berossus sat beneath the burning sun of Babylon and wrote a history that would one day vanish without a trace. He was no ordinary writer. He was a guardian of ancient Mesopotamian knowledge, trained in the temples of Marduk, fluent in both the sacred language of the Chaldeans and the Greek of his new rulers. And in his chronicles he described something extraordinary. A creature from the sea named Oannes, who taught mankind everything they knew. Berossus did not treat this as a fable. He recorded it as fact. But today, only fragments of his work survive. The rest has disappeared. And the question is no longer what he wrote, but who decided the world should forget it. Berossus composed his 3-volume history of Babylonian civilization during the rule of the Seleucid Empire. These books, written in Greek, were said to include the origins of the world, the knowledge of the stars, the stories of the kings before the flood, and the appearance of strange beings from the sea who came to guide mankind. Oannes was the first, half man, half fish, entirely divine in wisdom. It is from Berossus that we even know the name Oannes. Without him, the story would have drowned with time. But the strangest thing is what happened after. His works were read by scholars in Athens and copied by historians in Rome. Even early Christian thinkers knew of his writings. And then, one by one, the books vanished. Not in war, not by accident, but by design. Berossus was not included in the church's preserved canon. His books were never recopied in the monasteries. They were left out of the great libraries of Christendom. And slowly, like water evaporating from stone, his words faded. Only small quotes remained, bits and pieces cited by later historians like Josephus and Eusebius. Fragments that feel like whispers from a deeper truth. But why did these chronicles disappear? Why were they allowed to rot while other pagan authors were preserved? The answer lies in what Berossus described, a timeline that did not begin with Adam, a wisdom that came from the sea, not from the heavens, a vision of the world that saw humanity uplifted by beings not recognized by Scripture. Berossus was a threat, not because he lied, but because he remembered. He remembered a past older than the Bible, older than the flood of Noah, older than the God of Abraham. And in a world where the church would come to define history, there was no room for a voice like his, a voice that spoke of fish beings who gave math, writing, architecture, astronomy, and ethics. A voice that said humanity was not cursed from birth, but taught by those who came in peace. Today, Berossus is barely mentioned in textbooks. His name is absent from most classrooms. But his ghost remains. In the fragments he left behind, in the questions he forced us to ask, and in the silence that followed his disappearance. Perhaps it is not that we lost his work. Perhaps it was taken, buried in a vault, sealed in a library where no one is allowed to read. Because what he wrote, if fully recovered, might change everything we think we know about who we are, where we began, and who first lit the fire of human knowledge. Long before the first temples of stone rose from the earth, long before the pyramids, or the ziggurats, or the great towers of Babel, there were the Apkallu. In the ancient clay tablets of Mesopotamia, they are described not as gods, not quite as men, but something in between. 7 beings who emerged from the sea after the great flood and taught humanity everything it had forgotten. Oannes was only the first. He was the beginning of a lineage of knowledge bringers. Each of them appeared in succession, each with a body part man and part fish, wrapped in the mystery of the deep. Together, they formed a group that shaped the very structure of civilization. The name Apkallu means wise or sage in the Akkadian language, and wisdom was their gift. They did not arrive with weapons. They carried tablets. They taught the earliest humans how to build cities, how to organize governments, how to farm and harvest and keep records. They showed how to align buildings with the stars, how to read the skies, how to write laws that did not come from fear, but from understanding. The tablets call them holy, not because they demanded worship, but because they transformed chaos into order. What makes the Apkallu so strange is not that they are mentioned in myth, but how specific those mentions are. The ancient Sumerians wrote lists, names, lineages, descriptions of each of the 7 sages and what they taught. The records do not sound like legends. They read more like journals, like someone was keeping track. The most famous of these sages was Adapa, said to be the son of Ea, the god of the waters. He is often linked with Oannes himself, or seen as his continuation. He brought writing to humans, and for that he was called the one who broke the silence of the world. So who were these beings really? Were they gods sent from another realm? Survivors of a lost civilization who returned to restore what had been lost? Or perhaps something else entirely? Ancient engineers with knowledge so advanced that it still feels like magic to us today. The Church has never acknowledged the Apkallu. Their story does not appear in Christian doctrine. Their names are absent from the lists of saints or prophets. But they remain carved into stone, etched into tablets thousands of years older than the Bible. And that is the problem. If the Apkallu were real, then human history may not be the slow climb from ignorance to enlightenment that we have been told. It may be a story of interruption, a fall followed by a sudden rise, darkness followed by light, brought not by evolution, but by visitors from the sea. And if the Apkallu were only myths, why did their story spread so far, across cultures and borders and time? Why did their images appear on temple walls, always with fish cloaks, always in pairs, always holding something that looks like knowledge? Perhaps the real question is not whether they were real, but why their story was quietly erased from the libraries that shaped the modern world. Because the more you learn about them, the more it seems that someone, somewhere, does not want us to remember the teachers who came from the deep. Across continents separated by oceans and mountains, among cultures that supposedly never met, one story keeps surfacing. A being arrives not from the sky, but from the sea. They are teachers, builders, civilizers. They bring law, art, agriculture, astronomy. And strangely, they all share something in common. They are serpentine or aquatic, scaled, shining, often described as fish-like or dragon-like. In West Africa, the Dogon people speak of the Nomo, twin beings who came from the sky in a vessel that landed in the water. The Nomo were part fish, part spirit, and they brought with them the structure of society, the order of nature, and star knowledge that modern science only confirmed centuries later. The Dogon knew of Sirius B, a star invisible to the naked eye, long before telescopes could prove its existence. Their oral traditions say this knowledge was given to them directly by the Nomo, who returned to the water and promised to one day return. Travel thousands of miles west, and the Inca speak of Viracocha, a bearded god who came from the sea after a great flood, bringing laws, healing, and knowledge. He wore a long robe and carried a staff. He was described as white-skinned and unlike any local people. When his work was done, he disappeared across the ocean, promising to return. In Mesoamerica, the Maya and Aztecs spoke of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, not a dragon to be feared, but a bringer of science, medicine, and peace. He too came from the east, across the water, and vanished in the same direction. These stories are not echoes of each other. They are nearly identical in form, even though the people who told them were separated by oceans and had no shared written language. And yet, they speak of the same pattern. Beings that came from the water, stayed for a time, gave knowledge, and then vanished. Why does this matter? Because the Church has spent centuries creating a linear, isolated version of human history. According to official doctrine, truth came once, through one source, through one revelation. The idea that other civilizations were visited by teachers with almost supernatural intelligence directly challenges that narrative. The Vatican has never commented on the Nomo or Viracocha or Quetzalcoatl. These names do not appear in any church-approved history of the world. They are ignored, as if the stories themselves are too strange to be acknowledged. But why? The answer may be fear. Not of demons or false gods, but of the possibility that these stories are real. If aquatic messiahs existed across the globe, then humanity's awakening was not a miracle that happened once in the deserts of the Middle East. It was something that happened everywhere, in different forms, under different names, but always following the same script. And if that script is older, deeper, and more universal than the Church's own version of history, then the control of memory starts to unravel. Perhaps these aquatic messiahs are not myths, but memories. Memories shared across generations, encoded in myth, because the truth was too powerful to be left in plain sight. And maybe that is why they were buried. Not because they were false, but because they were too true, too old, too independent of the story the Church wanted the world to believe. Before the world was shaped by books and churches, before doctrine declared what was sacred and what was sinful, there was water. Not just as a river or an ocean, but as a voice. In the oldest myths across the planet, the sea was more than just a body of water. It was alive. It spoke. It revealed. It taught. In Sumer, the god Enki ruled the waters of wisdom. His realm was not the sky, but the deep. The great Abzu beneath the earth held the source of all knowledge. In Egypt, the Nile was a holy vein through which divine order flowed. In India, the sacred river Saraswati was believed to carry the voice of the gods themselves. Even in Norse mythology, wisdom was drawn from a well, guarded at the roots of the world tree by beings older than the gods. Water was memory. It held time. It reflected truth. It cleansed not just the body, but the soul and the mind. This idea existed long before Christianity. In these ancient traditions, the sea was not a threat. It was a teacher. It held secrets for those brave enough to seek them. But something changed. With the rise of the Christian Church, the waters that once spoke began to be silenced. In the book of Genesis, water becomes a force of chaos, a flood sent to erase mankind. In the New Testament, the sea is the place where demons are cast, where storms rise to test faith, where Peter walks only to sink. The ocean becomes wild, dangerous, something to fear. And the question is, why? Why did the church take something once seen as sacred and turn it into a symbol of destruction? The answer may lie in what water represents. Water cannot be owned. It flows freely. It connects lands, cultures, memories. In the old stories, wisdom came from the sea because it did not belong to any one people. It could not be locked away or controlled, and that made it dangerous. The church built its power on hierarchy and control, on declaring one path to salvation, one book, one truth. But the sea told a different story, one of many paths, of knowledge that came not from one mountain, but from the deep, from the undercurrent of time. By painting the sea as chaos, the church replaced curiosity with fear. By turning water into a force of divine punishment, it erased its role as a source of revelation. The flood became not a rebirth, but a warning. Sailors were seen not as explorers, but as those who risked damnation, and the old gods of the water were demonized or forgotten. Enki became a serpent, Poseidon became a devil. Even baptism, the one surviving water ritual in Christianity, was stripped of its older meaning. No longer a return to wisdom, but a symbolic drowning and rebirth under church authority. When the waters spoke, they whispered truths no institution could control. And maybe that is why those voices had to be silenced, not because they lied, but because they remembered. And in that remembering was a power older than any scripture, a power the church could never tame. So the ocean was made dark, its stories buried, its teachers erased, and the world was taught to look upward for truth, forgetting that once, long ago, truth rose from below, from the water, from the deep. Walk into any church and you will find it. A simple bowl of water. Sometimes it is carved into marble, sometimes set in gold. But no matter how it looks, it holds the same meaning. Baptism, the act of being washed in water to begin a new life, to cleanse the soul, to be reborn. It is one of the oldest and most sacred rituals in Christianity. But what if it is older than Christianity itself? What if baptism is not a beginning, but a memory? A leftover piece of something much deeper, something the church did not create, but inherited. Long before John the Baptist poured water over Jesus in the Jordan River, ancient cultures used water in ceremonies of transformation. In the temples of Egypt, priests bathed before speaking to the gods. In the mystery schools of Greece, initiates were submerged in sacred springs before learning hidden truths. The Essens, a Jewish sect near the Dead Sea, practiced daily immersion in water as a form of purification and awakening. And in the Indus Valley, ancient ruins show pools built not for drinking or farming, but for ritual bathing. Across the world, water was never just for washing. It was for remembering. Remembering what, exactly? That water connects life to something eternal. That to enter water is to leave the world of men and return to something more ancient. In old rites, the person entering water did not simply come out clean. They came out different. They were given knowledge, a new name, a new path. The ritual was often tied to secret teachings, passed only to those who had touched the deep. It was not about forgiveness. It was about transformation. When the early church formed, it did not invent baptism. It repurposed it, took a sacred act and changed the story. Instead of entering the water to find inner knowledge, people were now entering to wash away sin. Instead of learning forgotten truths, they were told to obey a new doctrine. The water stayed, but the meaning shifted. The mystery became a rule. The ritual became a gate controlled by the church. But echoes of the old world remain. Why water? Why not fire, or wind, or light? Why do so many faiths across time choose water as the bridge between this life and something greater? Because water holds memory. Because it was always the element of initiation, not into religion, but into wisdom, into knowing who we truly are. The surface ripples, but beneath it something ancient sleeps, something the church could never fully erase. When a child is baptized today, they are told it is a beginning, a welcome into the faith. But what if it is more than that? What if the ritual remembers what we have forgotten? That once water was the teacher, that once to be baptized was to remember where we came from, not just from dust, but from the sea, from the place where Oannes and others like him first emerged, where the deep still holds the memory of everything the surface has lost. You have seen it carved into stone, etched on ancient tombs, drawn on secret walls where early Christians once gathered in hiding. A simple shape, two arcs intersecting to form a fish. It is called the ichthys, and for many it means nothing more than faith. But symbols do not survive thousands of years by accident. And this one, this quiet fish floating beneath the waves of history, carries more than just a message of belief. It may carry a memory far older than the church itself, a memory of teachers from the sea. In the early days of Christianity, when Rome still hunted down believers and threw them to the lions, Christians used the fish as a code. Ichthys in Greek spelled out a hidden phrase: Jesus Christ, Son of God, Saviour. It was a way to speak without speaking, to mark a wall without being caught. But what no one asks is this: why a fish? Why not a cross, or a dove, or a sun? Why the image of a creature from the water? And more importantly, why does the fish symbol appear in cultures long before the time of Christ? In ancient Mesopotamia, the god of wisdom, Oannes, emerged from the Persian Gulf wearing the skin of a fish. He walked among humans, taught them to write, to build, to understand the stars. In images carved into stone, Oannes is always shown with a fish body, sometimes even emerging from the mouth of a great fish. He was not just a figure of power, he was a teacher, a guide, and he came from the sea. Travel to Egypt and you will find the Nile teeming with gods linked to water. In India, Vishnu takes the form of a fish to save the world from a flood. In Greece, early mystery schools spoke of fish as symbols of hidden wisdom. All across the ancient world, the fish did not mean faith. It meant knowledge, lost knowledge, secret knowledge. And then, quietly, it was adopted by the church. So what if the ichthys is not just a symbol of belief, but a sign of inheritance? What if the early Christians weren't creating a new symbol, but reviving an older one? What if, in the middle of persecution and silence, they reached for something deeper than doctrine? A sign that said, "We remember. We remember the teachers who came from the sea. We remember the wisdom that came before the empire, before the cross, before the rules were written in stone." Jesus told his disciples they would become fishers of men. But was that just a metaphor, or a clue? A hint that they were continuing something ancient, that the waters still held something sacred, that the fish was more than a symbol. It was a map, a whisper from the deep, a sign that knowledge once came wrapped in scales, walking on land, teaching in silence, and then disappearing beneath the waves once more. Maybe the church kept the fish to mark faith, but maybe someone else kept it to mark memory. A secret waiting in plain sight. A forgotten story drawn with two simple lines, curving toward each other, just like the past curving toward the truth. Walk through the grand halls of the Vatican, and you will see it. Paintings of Greek philosophers lining the walls, statues of Roman emperors standing in silent honor, echoes of Plato, Aristotle, and Cicero woven into the very structure of Catholic thought. The Church does not hide its connection to classical philosophy. It celebrates it. St. Augustine quoted Plato. Thomas Aquinas built his theology on the bones of Aristotle. Rome never truly died. It was baptized. But look deeper, and you will notice something strange. The Church welcomes the voices of Greece and Rome, yet remains utterly silent on the civilizations that came before. Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, and most of all, the story of Oannes. It is not that these civilizations are unknown. The clay tablets of Mesopotamia are among the oldest written texts in the world. They predate the Bible by thousands of years. They describe gods, kings, star maps, and floods. But within them lies something far more uncomfortable. They tell of beings who came not from heaven, but from the sea. Oannes, the fish-cloaked teacher, is named directly. A being who walked among humans and taught them to live with wisdom. He did not demand worship. He offered knowledge. And that makes him dangerous. Because if Oannes was real, or even if he was part of a preserved memory, then he challenges everything the Church claims about the beginning of civilization. Genesis is no longer the first chapter. Eden is no longer the first garden. And God is no longer the only source of light. Instead, we are faced with another origin story, one where humanity was not punished, but uplifted. Not by sin, but by teaching. Not by angels, but by sages from the sea. The Vatican has never addressed Oannes, not in any official documents, not in public sermons, not even in scholarly discussions about ancient texts. He's absent. And silence, when it stretches this long, is rarely accidental. The Church has had access to the tablets of Mesopotamia since they were first uncovered in the 19th century. Scholars have translated them. Museums have displayed them. But the Vatican never speaks his name. Not because it cannot, but because it will not. When Greek gods were reimagined, some were turned into saints, others into demons. Roman virtues were reshaped into Christian values. But what about the sea gods of Mesopotamia? What about Oannes and the Apkallu? They were simply erased, ignored. Because their story does not bend easily to doctrine. You cannot make Oannes a prophet. He taught without religion. You cannot make him a demon. He brought peace. You cannot make him vanish. His name is carved in stone. So the only option left is silence. And that silence speaks volumes. It tells us that somewhere in the deepest rooms of the Vatican archives, there may be knowledge older than Rome, older than the Church, older than the cross. Knowledge that connects us not to heaven, but to the deep. And that is a connection the Church has spent centuries trying to forget. Because once people remember where they truly came from, they may no longer need permission to find the light. In the shadowed ruins of ancient Nineveh, buried beneath centuries of dust and conquest, a forgotten library once waited to be found. It belonged to Ashurbanipal, the last great king of Assyria, who ruled during the 7th century before Christ. Unlike other kings of his time, Ashurbanipal was not just a warrior. He was a collector of knowledge. And in his palace, he built something few rulers ever dared to imagine. A library, not made of paper or scrolls, but of clay. Thousands of tablets etched with tiny wedge-shaped symbols known as cuneiform. Together, they formed one of the oldest collections of written knowledge on Earth. When British archaeologists uncovered this library in the mid-1800s, they were stunned. Among the tablets were hymns, prayers, medical texts, maps of the stars, and stories so ancient they made Greek myths look young. But buried within the collection were fragments of something far stranger. The story of Oannes, a being who rose from the sea and taught the earliest humans how to live. These were not fairy tales. They were written as history, as records, as memory. The tablets described Oannes as a creature of both land and sea, human in form but covered in the scales of a fish. He emerged each day from the Persian Gulf and returned at night to the waters. He brought writing, law, mathematics, architecture. He brought civilization itself. This was not just a creation story. It was a claim that humanity had once been visited by something other. And that visit changed everything. But here is the strange part. Once these tablets were translated, they were not placed on display for the world to see. Most were stored, hidden in drawers, sealed in archives. The British Museum holds tens of thousands of these tablets. Only a fraction have ever been translated. Fewer still have been shown to the public. And the ones that mention Oannes are often brushed aside as mythology, even when they sit beside texts considered historical fact. Why does this matter? Because the library of Ashurbanipal is older than the Bible, older than the Torah, older than almost every known religious text still used today. And yet, it tells a story the Church has never acknowledged, a story of beings from the deep, of wisdom not granted from heaven but rising from the sea, of a flood not just of water, but of knowledge. And when that knowledge was rediscovered, it was quickly locked away again. The Church has never spoken about Ashurbanipal's library, but they know it exists, they know what it contains, and they know what it suggests. That the story of humanity's awakening may not begin with Adam or Moses or even Christ. It may begin with a creature stepping out of the waves and handing us the keys to civilization, and so the tablets remain, pressed into ancient clay, silent, waiting, not lost, but ignored, as if the truth they carry was too dangerous to fully destroy and far too powerful to ever be shared. In the 3rd century before Christ, a Babylonian priest named Berossus wrote a history that may have changed everything. He was a man of two worlds, born in the land of the Chaldeans, but fluent in Greek, trained in the temples of Babylon, but living under the rule of the Seleucid Empire. Berossus had access to something rare, the old tablets, the clay records from Sumer and Akkad, the myths that came before myths, and in 3 volumes he set out to tell the story of the world as it had been remembered in his land. He wrote of kings who ruled before the flood, of star charts that mapped the heavens long before telescopes, and most importantly, of a creature named Oannes who rose from the sea and brought knowledge to mankind. He did not claim it was a dream. He wrote it as history. Greek scholars read Berossus. Roman historians quoted him. Early Christian thinkers were aware of his work. He was not ignored. He was included. But then, somehow, his books disappeared. Not burned in war, not crumbled with time, simply gone. All that remains today are scattered fragments quoted by later authors. A paragraph here, a sentence there, pieces of a puzzle with the center missing. And that center is Oannes. What makes this so strange is that the Catholic Church preserved an enormous amount of ancient literature, Greek tragedies, Roman law, philosophical treatises. Entire libraries of pagan thought were copied and stored in monasteries throughout the Middle Ages. Plato survived. Aristotle survived. So did Homer, Cicero, Seneca. Even writers who challenged church doctrine were sometimes preserved for reference or debate. But Berossus did not survive. His books were never recopied, never translated into Latin, never included in the great libraries of Europe. Why? Because Berossus told a different origin story. One that did not begin with Adam, or the garden, or the fall of man. His version spoke of a teacher from the deep, a being part man and part fish, who taught humans not religion, but knowledge. He spoke of civilizations that rose and fell before the flood, of wisdom older than any scripture. And in a world where the church defined truth, that kind of memory was dangerous. The loss of Berossus was not just a literary accident. It was a decision, a choice to let his voice fall silent while others were preserved, a way to erase a thread that led too far away from the approved narrative. Because if Oannes was remembered, so too would be the idea that truth did not always come from the sky, that sometimes it rose from the water. And so the books vanished, hidden in time, replaced by stories more manageable. The church did not need to deny Oannes. It only needed to forget him, and in doing so, it taught the world to forget as well. But fragments remain, enough to ask questions, enough to wonder. And perhaps one day, buried in some archive or beneath a sealed vault, the lost books of Berossus still wait. Not destroyed, just delayed, preserved in silence, waiting for someone to listen again. The world had ended, not with fire, but with water. That was the story passed down by the ancient Sumerians. A great flood had swallowed cities, erased kings, and silenced the noise of civilization. What came before the flood was barely remembered. What came after was broken, until something rose from the sea. A figure not from the sky, but from the deep. His name was Oannes, and he arrived not as a conqueror, but as a teacher. He came to restore what had been lost. Sumerian tablets describe a civilization that thrived before the waters came. Cities built with precision, systems of law, farming, mathematics, knowledge of the stars. But then, for reasons still debated, the flood arrived. It tore through the known world, wiping the slate clean. In the Bible, this moment is mirrored in the story of Noah. The rain fell for 40 days. The earth was washed of its wickedness. Only one family survived. But the Sumerian version is older. And in that version, after the waters receded, a strange figure stepped onto land. Oannes appeared not to warn of judgment, but to rebuild. He brought writing. He showed people how to cultivate the land again. He gave language, numbers, calendars. In this telling, humanity was not punished. It was helped. The flood was not the end of the story. It was the moment a new kind of knowledge was given. And the question is, why did this version fade into obscurity while the biblical one was raised as absolute truth? The church has always taught the flood as a moral lesson. Mankind sinned, and God sent water to destroy them. Noah survived because he was obedient. Civilization began again under divine control. But in the Sumerian account, the flood is a turning point, not a punishment. It is a door. And what walks through that door is not a prophet or a priest, but a hybrid figure who defies categories. Oannes is not sent from the heavens. He comes from the sea, from below. If these two flood stories came from the same origin, then something happened along the way. The version where knowledge returned was buried. The version where fear ruled was elevated. And maybe that shift was not an accident. Maybe the idea of a flood, followed by learning, was too dangerous for a system built on control. It suggests that humanity is not meant to forget, but to remember. That after every collapse, something waits to rise. Not in temples, not in churches, but in the places no one expects. The idea that Oannes helped rebuild a broken world changes everything. It suggests that knowledge did not start with Genesis, that there was a world before the Bible, a world before the church, and someone, or something, wanted us to rebuild it, to find it again. Perhaps that is the real reason his story was buried, because if we knew what came before the flood, we might stop fearing it. We might start searching for what was lost, and we might find it. Hidden not in the sky, but beneath the waves. In the beginning, there were many beginnings. Cultures around the world told stories of how life came to be. Some spoke of gods rising from the earth. Others told of animals shaping the land. Many described figures who came from the sea, bearing gifts of knowledge and light. These were not fairy tales. They were sacred. They were remembered, passed down from generation to generation like fragile fire in the dark. But when the church rose to power, it chose one beginning, one story, one voice, and with that choice, the others were silenced. Genesis became the official account. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That sentence became a wall. Everything outside of it was labeled false, myth, heresy. Genesis told of a sky god shaping man from clay and breathing life into his lungs. It spoke of gardens, serpents, and sin. It gave the church a timeline, a purpose, a weapon, and most importantly, it gave them a monopoly on origins. The problem was, other stories had come first. In Mesopotamia, long before Genesis was written, scribes described the world beginning in the deep. The gods emerged from the waters. The stars were mapped by sea-born beings. Oannes was one of them. Not a creator, but a restorer. Not a punisher, but a guide. In these stories, knowledge was not a forbidden fruit. It was a gift. And the givers did not fall from the sky. They rose from the sea. But the church could not allow multiple beginnings, multiple truths. That would mean multiple sources of authority. And so, they created a singular path. They declared all other creation stories to be lies, illusions, or worse, tricks of the devil. The sea gods of Babylon, the water spirits of Africa, the serpent teachers of the Americas, all of them were erased or demonized. Oannes was forgotten. The Apkallu were buried. The Nomo were never mentioned. And the sea, once a source of wisdom, became a symbol of chaos. By controlling the beginning, the church controlled everything else. If Genesis was true, then every other story had to be false. If Adam was the first man, then nothing before him could be real. The past became a battlefield, and the church guarded it fiercely. They built schools, wrote textbooks, commissioned paintings and sermons, all repeating the same creation, over and over, until people stopped asking what came before. But the old stories did not vanish completely. They lingered in ruins, in oral traditions, in half-burned tablets buried beneath the sands. They speak of a time when the world wasn't ruled by sin, but by the arrival of wisdom, when knowledge came not in thunder, but in the quiet sound of water breaking. Maybe that is why the church feared them, because they offered a truth that did not need a middleman, a truth that suggested humanity was not born broken, but born curious, and someone, or something, answered that curiosity not with punishment, but with teaching. To declare Genesis as the only beginning was to draw a line, a border around what could be believed. But the sea does not care for borders. It flows where it wills, And somewhere beneath those waves, the older origins still wait. Not gone, just ignored, ready to rise again. For centuries, the Church taught that the sea was not to be trusted. It was vast, wild, untamable, a place of danger and temptation. Sailors were warned of sea monsters. Maps drew the edges of the world with open mouths and curling tentacles. And in sermons, the ocean was painted not as creation, but as chaos, a dark mirror of God's order. But beneath that fear lies something deeper, a question most never dared to ask. What exactly did the Church fear about the sea? In ancient texts, the sea was often linked to forbidden knowledge, to things that predated Scripture. In the book of Job, Leviathan lurks beneath the waves, not just a creature, but a symbol of something ancient and untouchable. In early Christian folklore, sirens called sailors to their doom, not with violence, but with song, with beauty, with truth too strange for the land to hold. These were not just monsters, they were metaphors, warnings, that what lies beneath the surface might reveal a story the Church could not control. For centuries, sea voyages were not blessed. Monks and priests refused to offer prayers for journeys across the water. It was considered dangerous not only to the body, but to the soul, because the ocean carried more than storms. It carried memory, stories from distant lands, echoes of gods not born in Bethlehem, knowledge that had nothing to do with Rome. And in a world where belief had borders, the sea ignored all of them. Long before Christianity spread, the ocean was a sacred place. In Polynesian cultures, the sea was a path between worlds. In West Africa, water spirits governed fate and healing. In ancient Mesopotamia, it was from the sea that Oannes came, bringing language and science. To these cultures, the sea was not evil, it was divine. And maybe that was the real problem. When the Church rose to power, it needed to draw a line between what was holy and what was not. Heaven above, hell below. The land as God's domain, the sea as something fallen, something to fear. By turning water into a symbol of destruction, they could erase its older meanings. They could cut off access to the past, to stories where beings from the ocean gave humans not commandments, but understanding. But some knowledge is hard to bury. Sailors returned from distant shores with stories that didn't match the Bible. Maps showed lands never mentioned in Genesis. Artifacts appeared in the sand with symbols no monk could translate. And the ocean kept whispering, its waves crashing not just against rock, but against the walls built to keep history in line. So the Church kept its distance. Even as empires expanded, the sea remained something foreign, something wild. And in that wildness was danger, not just of drowning, but of discovering that the world was older, stranger, and more connected than the Bible ever claimed. That before the cross, there were other teachers. Before Genesis, other beginnings. And the sea, vast and endless, remembered all of them. Walk into a Renaissance cathedral and lift your eyes. At first you will see what everyone sees. Saints in robes, angels with golden wings. Biblical scenes framed in light and symmetry. It feels safe, familiar, approved. But look closer, and you begin to notice something strange. Shapes that do not belong. Figures wrapped in scales. Sea creatures woven into the corners. Tridents held in the hands of holy men. And in the edges of the canvas, where no one was supposed to look too hard, fragments of a much older story begin to surface. During the Renaissance, painters and sculptors worked under the gaze of the Church. Every brushstroke was supposed to glorify Scripture. But many of these artists were also scholars, alchemists, members of secret circles that studied ancient texts and whispered about forgotten truths. They read Plato and Pythagoras. Some even studied the tablets of Babylon that were slowly being translated by traveling merchants and hidden collectors. And in their work, they began to embed what they could not say out loud. In the Sistine Chapel, Michelangelo painted scenes so packed with layered meaning that scholars are still decoding them. Behind the prophets and the heroes, behind the approved stories, are figures that look strangely aquatic. Serpents that coil not in the garden, but in the deep. Fishtails hiding beneath the robes of angels. In other churches across Europe, frescoes show strange hybrid beings standing among disciples. Murals of Jonah show the fish that swallowed him not as an animal, but as a humanoid figure with large eyes and scaled arms. Sometimes what looks like Christ stepping from the water has behind him a shadow, a second figure, half man, half fish. Why would artists do this? Why risk punishment to hide sea gods beneath the nose of the church? Because they knew. They knew that the stories the church had silenced still mattered, that the myth of Oannes and the knowledge bringers of the sea was not just a tale, but a memory, a clue, and painting it into the walls of cathedrals was a way to preserve it, not in books that could be burned, but in beauty, in stone, in oil and plaster, hidden in plain sight. This was not rebellion, it was reverence. A way of saying that truth is not always simple, that sometimes it flows beneath the surface, and those who looked deep enough might find it. Some of these artists belonged to groups like the Rosicrucians or early Freemasons. They believed in a hidden history, a history guarded by symbols, passed through art, and protected from the fires of censorship by being disguised as faith. Today we walk past these paintings without knowing. We call them decoration, background. But maybe that is the point. The fish gods were never erased. They were transformed, painted not as gods, but as metaphors. Not as heresy, but as whispers from a deeper truth. A truth that still waits on the walls, still swims just beneath the surface, and still dares us to look again. In the first few centuries after Jesus walked the earth, there was not one Christianity, but many. Small groups scattered across deserts and cities, each holding different pieces of the story. Some followed Peter, others Paul. But there were others too, mystics and scribes who spoke in riddles, who believed that the teachings of Christ were not just about heaven and hell, but about something deeper, something older, something tied to the sea. Among these early believers were the Gnostics. They wrote gospels that the church would later call heresy, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Truth. But there were whispers of other texts, ones that spoke of Jesus not as the son of a sky god, but as a bringer of hidden wisdom, a revealer, a guide like Oannes. And in these texts, water was not just a background, it was the key. One lost manuscript referred to Jesus as the living water, not just in metaphor, but in form. That he moved like the sea, that he knew the language of the deep. Another hinted that his baptism was not a ritual, but a return. That when John lowered him into the Jordan, he was not becoming something new, but remembering something ancient. That water was not just where his ministry began, it was where it belonged. Some of these texts described disciples asking Jesus why he walked on water, and his reply was cryptic, that he did not defy the sea, but recognized it, that it knew him. These writings did not make it into the Bible. They were banned in the councils of the 4th century, labelled dangerous and confusing. Their authors were hunted, their scrolls burned, their ideas drowned under official doctrine. Why? Because they connected Christ to symbols the church could not control, to traditions older than Jerusalem, to gods and teachers who rose from the waves long before Genesis was written. If Jesus was part of that lineage, then the monopoly on divine truth was broken. If the sea had always been the source of knowledge, then Rome was just another voice, not the first and not the last. But fragments survived, buried in the desert, hidden in jars, found centuries later in places like Nag Hammadi. Scholars still debate what they mean. The church still warns against reading them. But the words speak for themselves. They speak of water not as danger, but as memory. They speak of a teacher who came not just to save, but to awaken. Maybe there was a gospel of the sea. Maybe it was never written down. Maybe it was passed in secret between those who listened to the waves, those who knew that truth doesn't always come from above. Sometimes it rises quietly from the deep, and sometimes it wears the face of a man who walks on water because the water remembers him. Atlantis was not just a myth, it was a warning. That is what Plato said. He told the story of a mighty civilization that had grown too proud, too advanced, too distant from the natural order. And so, the sea took it back. In one day and one night, Atlantis sank beneath the waves, leaving only stories behind. Most people read that tale and stopped there. A fantasy, a metaphor. But what if there is something else hidden beneath the surface? What if Atlantis was real? And what if its survivors became the gods we still whisper about? The timing is strange. Ancient Mesopotamian texts tell of the Apkallu, a group of 7 beings who emerged from the sea after a great flood. The first was Oannes, half man, half fish. He brought language, astronomy, architecture, and law. He wore no crown, asked for no worship. He only taught, like a messenger from something older than memory. And the stories say he came not from heaven, but from beneath the water, from a place that had once stood on land. Now place that beside Plato's Atlantis, a land that fell, a people who vanished, a wisdom that was lost. But what if it was not lost? What if it moved? What if those who escaped the collapse carried their knowledge to the shores of new civilizations? And when they arrived, walking from the sea covered in strange garments glowing with unfamiliar light, the people who saw them did not call them refugees. They called them gods. This idea is dangerous, because it means the foundations of our religions and our histories might be built not on divine revelation, but on survival. That the great teachers and bringers of knowledge were not angels or avatars, but remnants of a forgotten world. A world that once reached too far and paid the price. The church never officially condemned the story of Atlantis, but it never embraced it either. It was treated as a curiosity, not a clue, a symbol, not a source. And yet the story haunted thinkers for centuries. Secret societies like the Freemasons and the Rosicrucians studied it in private. Alchemists wrote of a sunken kingdom where pure knowledge still waited, and explorers searched for its ruins beneath the ocean floor. But the church kept silent. Because if Atlantis was real, then Genesis was not the beginning. If Oannes was a survivor, then the Bible was not the only truth. It was one version, one voice among many. Maybe that is why the myth was flipped, turned upside down. Oannes became a fish creature. The Apkallu became demons in later texts. Atlantis became a fairy tale. Because to admit they were real would unravel the entire structure. It would mean that we are not the first, that history is not a straight line but a circle, and that sometimes the teachers we think came from heaven actually rose from something we buried long ago. A city in the sea, a memory in the waves, a truth waiting to be remembered. High on the cliffs of Mali in West Africa, the Dogon people preserved a story that puzzled scholars for generations. It was not about conquest or kings. It was about the stars. The Dogon spoke of a distant place in the sky called Sirius. How they said it was not one star, but two. A system with an invisible companion. And they said that long ago beings came from that place. They came in water. They were shaped like fish. And they taught. The beings were called the Nomo, amphibious in nature, divine in wisdom. The Dogon said they descended to earth in a vessel that spun and roared like fire. But when it landed, it cooled and filled with water. From it, the Nomo emerged. They brought language, mathematics, stories of the cosmos. They taught the Dogon not just how to live, but how to look upward and understand. These were not gods in the traditional sense. They were messengers, and they had a mission. What makes this story impossible to ignore is what the Dogon knew. Long before Western astronomers confirmed the existence of Sirius B, a dense and invisible star locked in orbit with the bright Sirius A, the Dogon already described it. They even spoke of its weight and motion. How could an isolated tribe know such details without telescopes or science labs? Some said it was coincidence. Others guessed it came from contact with modern explorers. But the Dogon were speaking of Sirius B long before those explorers arrived. Their knowledge was embedded in ritual and myth passed through centuries. Now step back and remember Oannes, the fish being from the Persian Gulf who came to Mesopotamia, bringing knowledge after a great flood. He too was amphibious. He too brought writing, astronomy, and sacred lore. He too was remembered not as a conqueror, but as a teacher. Two cultures separated by oceans and time, yet both speak of fish-shaped beings who emerged from the water with maps of the stars and instructions for living. Are these independent myths or shared memories? Could it be that the Dogon and the Sumerians remembered the same event through different lenses? That whatever or whoever the Nomo and the Apkallu truly were, their appearances left such a mark that stories echoed across continents. Stories that survive even when civilizations fall. The Church has never acknowledged the Dogon. Their knowledge does not fit into the biblical timeline. Their fish gods do not resemble saints. Their star maps challenge the idea that wisdom comes only from Scripture. So their story is left in the margins, dismissed as myth, or quietly avoided. But the patterns remain. Beings from the water. Teachers, not rulers. Star knowledge beyond what should have been known. Whether the Nomo came from Sirius or not, the question still burns. Why does this story exist at all? Why does it match so closely with others from far away? Maybe these are not isolated tales. Maybe they are fragments of a single truth, scattered like pieces of a puzzle, waiting to be seen together. And maybe the stars remember what we were made to forget. They travelled farther than most ever dared. The Jesuits, priests in black robes carrying crosses and compasses sailing into jungles, deserts, and frozen frontiers. Their mission was simple: spread the word. But along the way, they did more than preach. They listened. They sat with elders and chiefs, with mystics and midwives. They asked questions, and they wrote everything down. From the 16th to the 18th century, Jesuit missionaries fanned out across Africa, Asia, the Americas, and the islands of the Pacific. What they found was not just resistance or curiosity, it was memory. Cultures all over the world told stories that echoed the same pattern. Beings that came from the sea, teachers with scales and wisdom, civilizers who emerged after floods or descended from stars and always brought knowledge. In South America, Jesuit scribes recorded legends of Viracocha, a bearded man who came from the water, taught the Inca to build, and vanished across the sea. In West Africa, they heard of water spirits and fish gods who shaped the land before the first kings. In Japan, the priests documented myths of dragon-like creatures from the ocean depths who taught the first emperors. In Polynesia, they were told of Tangaroa and other aquatic ancestors. All these stories collected with care, copied into journals and letters. But once the missionaries returned to Rome, something strange happened. The stories vanished. You will not find these aquatic myths in catechisms. They were not debated in church councils. They were never added to theology. Despite their global reach, the records were filed away forgotten in dusty archives or locked behind ecclesiastical seals. And the question is, why? Why were these shared memories not considered important? Why were they not explored as signs of divine patterns or even cultural connections? Because they did not support the narrative. These water teachers were not angels. They were not prophets sent by the church. They had no link to Rome. And perhaps most dangerous of all, they predated Christianity. Some had no religion at all. They simply taught mathematics, farming, star paths, language. Their stories suggested that truth had once come freely from the deep, not from altars or commandments. That knowledge was older than doctrine. The Jesuits may have sensed this. Some wrote in cryptic tones. Others hinted that the native myths held clues to a forgotten origin. But the hierarchy was clear. Doctrine first, discovery second. So the marine archives were never canonized. The ocean once again was left unspoken. Today only fragments survive, hidden in old libraries in Rome or buried in missionary journals kept in university vaults. Pieces of interviews with tribal elders, descriptions of ceremonies that honored beings from the sea. Clues that these stories were never just local inventions, but part of something global, something deeper. So where are those records now? Maybe still locked in the Vatican's restricted shelves, maybe mislabeled or misfiled. Or maybe waiting for someone to notice that every time the Jesuits asked where knowledge came from, the answer was almost always the same: from the water. From the beings who rose not to conquer, but to remind us of who we were before forgetting began. You can find Mercury in cathedrals, his winged feet reimagined as symbols of divine speed. You can find Diana renamed as a virgin martyr. Even Pan, the wild god of nature, was twisted into the horns and hooves of the Christian devil. The church was a master of absorption. It took old gods and reshaped them, smoothed their edges, or sharpened them into warnings. But there is one figure who never made the leap. One name you will not see in stained glass or on the walls of a basilica: Oannes. He does not appear in the margins of illuminated manuscripts. He is not transformed into a demon to frighten children. He is not sanctified into a misunderstood saint. He is simply missing. Erased not with fire, but with silence. And the question lingers: why? Because Oannes was different. He was not worshipped with blood or sacrifice. He did not demand temples or declare wars. He brought knowledge. He taught. The story says he came from the sea, dressed in the skin of a fish, walked among humans during the day, and returned to the water at night. He gave writing, agriculture, astronomy. He helped humans become more than animals. And then he vanished. Unlike the gods of Olympus or Asgard, Oannes did not act like a deity. He acted like a guide, a teacher. That made him harder to control, harder to vilify. The church could not paint him as a monster without distorting his nature. And they could not safely canonize him without admitting that civilization did not begin with Eden. This was the true threat of Oannes. He did not fit the binary. He was not divine or demonic. He was liminal, a bridge between worlds, between the surface and the deep, between memory and myth. And most dangerously of all, his story existed outside the church's control. It came from Sumerian tablets, not scripture. From Berossus, not Moses. From the sea, not the sky. If Oannes had been absorbed, he would have raised questions the church could not answer. Why would God need to send a fish-cloaked teacher thousands of years before Christ? Why would this being bring knowledge rather than commandments? Why would ancient civilizations revere a figure who walked from the ocean instead of descending from heaven? The story breaks the pattern. So, it was left out. Even as Renaissance art flirted with forbidden symbols, even as alchemists and mystics hinted at lost truths, Oannes remained hidden. Not because no one remembered him, but because too many did. He was the archetype that would not bend, the original teacher, the one who came not to judge, but to awaken. And in a system built on hierarchy and fear, that kind of figure is more dangerous than any devil. So his name was buried, his image unpainted, but the silence speaks volumes. Oannes was not forgotten because he was false. He was erased because he was true. And sometimes the truths that cannot be reshaped are the ones most feared of all. Somewhere beneath the Vatican, there is a silence deeper than any cathedral. A place without sunlight or songs where time itself seems to slow. It is called the Secret Archive, but its real name is longer. The Archivum Secretum Apostolicum Vaticanum. A vault stretching over 80 kilometers filled with scrolls and codices, some so old their ink was drawn from crushed stone. Most people think it is just paperwork. Papal letters, royal treaties, dusty theology. But what if that is just the surface? What if something older lies beneath? For centuries, rumors have swirled around what the Vatican really keeps hidden. Banned gospels, pagan texts, scientific documents from lost ages. But one whisper stands out among the rest, that somewhere within those shelves behind coded locks and thick doors, there are records of beings from the sea, references to the Apkallu, descriptions of Oannes, and even ancient Babylonian tablets smuggled from ruins before they could fall into academic hands. Not stored in museums, but in marble chambers under Rome. Why would the church collect such things? Not to study them, but to hide them. Because these stories do not fit the sacred timeline. If Oannes was real, then knowledge did not begin with Adam. If the Apkallu brought writing and law, then Moses was not the first to receive sacred instruction. If scrolls exist that link early Christian mystics to the teachings of aquatic beings, then the origin of the church is no longer in a desert, but in the depths. That kind of revelation would shake the foundation. There is precedent. The church has acquired and sealed countless texts through the ages, some during the Crusades, others during colonial conquests. Manuscripts taken from Egypt, Mesopotamia, Ethiopia. Some were translated and filtered into the canon. Others were locked away. Too dangerous, too strange, too illuminating. And every once in a while, a fragment leaks. a letter from a missionary describing a fish god worshipped by locals, a note from a Jesuit warning of sea myths that resemble Genesis but with different characters, clues that something is being held back. If tablets about Oannes exist in the Vatican vaults, they could change everything. They might show that the myth was not a myth, that his appearance after the flood was part of a cycle, not a miracle. They could include star maps, rituals, teachings lost to history. A glimpse into a civilization that came before ours. A pre-flood world where beings from the water did not rule but guided, helped, remembered. Maybe the reason Oannes has no image in Christian art is because his true form was drawn on clay thousands of years ago, and that clay is now sitting beneath Rome, not displayed, not studied, just waiting, hidden beneath waves of silence and behind vaults of stone. And maybe one day someone will open the right door, and a flood will come, not of water, but of memory, and the world will remember what it was never supposed to know, that before we were taught we were shown, and the first teacher came not from the heavens, but from the deep. There is an old whisper that runs through the roots of almost every ancient culture, a promise or a warning, depending on who is listening, that one day the beings who came before will come again, not from the sky, but from the water. They are called many names: the Nomo, the Apkallu, the seven sages, the water bringers. They arrived after floods, when the earth was quiet and broken. They taught, and then they vanished. But not forever, because the myths say they will return. In Dogon stories, the Nomo promised they would come back when the stars align. In Sumerian tablets, the Apkallu are said to dwell in the deep, waiting for a time of great need. In Hopi prophecies, the world is said to go through cycles, and at the end of each one, teachers arrive from the sea to guide humanity back to balance. Even in early Christian mysticism, there were whispers of a second coming, not just of Christ, but of the knowledge bearers who preceded him. Not all of these stories survived, but enough did to draw a pattern. The idea is simple, that the beings who brought us language maps and memory never truly left, that they retreated, or were pushed away, and that they will return when the world is ready, or when it is once again lost. Some say they will rise with the oceans. Others say they will come in dreams or visions or strange ships that surface in silence. But all agree that their return is tied to knowledge. Forbidden knowledge, the kind that breaks illusion. And maybe that is what the Church fears most. Not devils or demons, but revelation. That what it worked so hard to bury might one day rise on its own. That Oannes and the others might come back not as symbols or stories, but as something real, tangible, unavoidable, and that when they do, they will not ask permission. They will not seek approval. They will simply begin teaching again, like before. Imagine what that would mean. A return of truth, not filtered through doctrine or ritual, but direct. Ancient wisdom flooding back into a world that has forgotten how to listen. A reawakening not controlled by priests or politicians, but by memory. And not just any memory, but a memory carried by the water itself, passed through tides and currents, held in the salt and the silence of the deep. The return of the water bringers would undo centuries of control. It would challenge every narrative built on fear. It would restore the idea that truth is not owned, but shared. That knowledge is not dangerous, unless someone is trying to hide it. And that maybe the greatest threat to power is not rebellion, but remembering. So the question is not if they will return. It is whether we will see them when they do, whether we will recognize the shape of the forgotten in the rising mist, whether we will listen, or whether once again we will turn away, afraid not of monsters, but of teachers, of the ones who came from the sea and are coming still. When ancient people looked up at the night sky, they did not see emptiness. They saw a mirror. A vast black sea stretching above their heads, filled with shimmering lights like fish moving through water. They gave the stars names, traced gods and animals into their patterns, and told stories of beings who travelled between the stars the same way others sailed across oceans. It is easy to forget that for most of human history, the sky was not dry or cold. It was alive, deep, and strangely familiar. Today we know more about the universe than ever before. Telescopes peer into galaxies beyond our imagination. Satellites swim through space like silent vessels. And yet, the more we explore the cosmos, the more it begins to resemble something we already know. The ocean. Both are dark and endless. Both are filled with life, most of which remains unseen. Both hold pressures that would crush us, and mysteries we can barely explain. It is no surprise, then, that many ancient myths may not have drawn a sharp line between sea and sky. They may have seen them as the same thing, just viewed from different angles. In Mesopotamian stories, the gods did not come from above, but from the deep. Oannes emerged from the water, yet brought knowledge of the heavens. The Apkallu taught astrology while wrapped in fish skins. The Dogon of Mali spoke of the Nommo, who descended in a watery vessel from the Sirius star system, and returned to it the same way. The Hopi believed the sky people and the water people were one, that portals between dimensions could open through lakes and oceans. In each of these tales, the water was not just symbolic, it was literal, a medium between realms. What if the sea was never just about the earth? What if it was used to teach about space? In a world without modern science, how else could you describe the experience of floating through blackness, surrounded by strange lights? How else could you speak of beings who travelled between stars and returned glowing with wisdom? The sea was the closest comparison. It was the unknown, the dangerous, the beautiful. It was the true sky. And maybe that is why the sea myths were buried. Because they carried more than memory. They carried understanding. They hinted at an ancient awareness that the cosmos was not an empty void, but a living presence. That the same currents guiding fish beneath the waves might guide stars across the firmament. That what came from the sea might have also come from the stars. In trying to separate heaven from ocean, the Church divided something that was once whole. It made the sky a place of judgment and the sea a place of fear. But older voices tell a different story, one where the universe flows not above us, but through us, where the stars are ships, the waves are maps, and the deep is not a danger but a doorway, a memory, a mirror of the cosmos itself. The world the Church built was one of opposites, heaven above, hell below, light and darkness, sin and salvation. There was no middle ground, no place between. You were either saved or you were lost. And in this strict design, every figure, every story had to fit the pattern. But Oannes did not. He came from neither the sky nor the pit. He rose from the sea. And he brought not commandments or punishments, but knowledge. That alone made him dangerous. Not because he threatened to destroy the faith, but because he showed a different way to understand existence, a third realm, a space beyond the binary. Oannes did not preach repentance. He did not ask for worship. He offered information, how to build, how to write, how to map the stars. His message was not about what to believe, but how to think. And for a system built on obedience, that kind of teaching is far more threatening than heresy. In this third realm, there is no eternal reward or endless fire. There is only learning, growing, remembering. Oannes belonged to that realm, the realm of sages and watchers and guides who do not demand loyalty, but offer truth like a tool to be used or ignored. It is a realm hinted at in Gnostic texts and Eastern philosophies, a place of balance and cycles, not judgment, a place the Church worked hard to erase. By dividing reality into two opposing sides, the Church made itself the gatekeeper. Only through them could one reach heaven. Only by avoiding their defined sins could one escape hell. But a third realm means there are other paths, other ways of knowing, other kinds of teachers. It breaks the monopoly. It opens the possibility that truth might come from the sea or the stars or the silence within. That sacredness is not controlled, but discovered. Maybe that is why Oannes was never rewritten like the other gods, why he was not turned into a saint or a demon, because he could not be. His message did not fit, and trying to reshape him would only call attention to what he really represented. The forgotten space in the middle, the realm of wisdom. It is the realm of Hermes and Thoth, of Enoch, and the Apkallu of the Nommo, and the ancient builders who left no names. All teachers, all walkers between worlds, none demanding worship, all offering a key, and it is that key the Church feared most. Because it unlocks a truth too big for one book, too deep for one doctrine. A truth that whispers, we are more than sinners or saints, that life is not a test but a journey, that the ocean holds more than water, it holds memory. And in that memory is a realm without thrones or flames, just light, not from above, but from within. The realm of the third path, the third eye, the third truth, not heaven, not hell, but something older. And Oannes was its first messenger. Memory is like the tide. It comes in waves, sometimes gentle, sometimes overwhelming. And just like the sea, it carries what has been lost and deposits it where it can be found again. The story of Oannes may not be literal. He may not have walked from the Persian Gulf in fish skin or spoken directly to humans. But he exists as a symbol, a marker of what humanity once knew and has since forgotten. He is the whisper of knowledge beneath the waves of history. Consider the ancient tablets that survived fire and time, the forgotten scrolls tucked away by missionaries, the myths carried by cultures separated by oceans and centuries. All of them tell a similar story, that there were beings who brought wisdom before kings or temples. That knowledge was not always controlled by the powerful, that someone or something once walked among humans simply to teach. Oannes is the embodiment of that lost memory, and the truth is not gone. It lies beneath the surface, waiting for eyes willing to see, for minds ready to question. Every legend of the sea, every story of fish people, every myth of teachers emerging after floods is a wave, carrying fragments of something older, something deeper. And if we pay attention, if we listen, we might catch the current. We might glimpse the shape of knowledge as it once was. We might remember what the Church and time and fear tried to bury. Oannes is also a warning that when knowledge is suppressed, when stories are erased, when symbols are forbidden, the human mind grows blind. But memory is resilient. Like the ocean, it cannot be fully contained. It seeps through cracks. It rises in dreams. It appears in art and ritual and myth, even when authorities try to silence it. And if we follow these traces, we find not just stories, but patterns. Evidence that humans have always sought understanding beyond what was taught. That we have always looked for the teacher who comes from the water, from the stars, from the deep. Perhaps that is why so many cultures speak of a return. That the knowledge once lost is not gone forever. That the wave of memory comes back when the time is right. And maybe it is not a literal being that returns, but the awakening. The realization that truth is not owned. That wisdom cannot be chained. That what we were taught to forget is simply waiting for us to remember. The final wave of memory does not roar or crash. It arrives quietly, subtly. A thought, a question, a rediscovered text, a symbol in a painting, a story told at dusk. And in that moment, we understand. Oannes was never just a character. He was a mirror, a map, a key. And the sea he came from is the repository of human potential. The depths of what we have always known but were told to ignore. The waves rise, and we can dive or we can float. And in choosing to dive, we remember